Welcome to Hard Talk with me, Zeinab Badawi. Amidst his pronouncements on foreign policy, Donald Trump has ratcheted up the rhetoric on Iran, calling the nuclear agreement with Tehran the worst deal ever negotiated. He's expanded US sanctions on Iran after it tested a missile in January. My guest is Iranian academic Mohammad from Tehran, who supports the leadership in Iran. What is the Iranians' response to criticisms from Trump over its missile testing? And is Iran fueling terror and conflicts in the Middle East? Mohammad in Tehran, welcome to Hard Talk. What does the Iranian leadership think of President Trump?
Well, thank you for having me. I think that they're still watching with great interest. At the moment, the Iranians have not made many comments about what is going on in the United States. In many ways, they feel that Trump perhaps is not so bad for Iran in the sense that he is not doing a good job so far with regards to the international community. He has problems with the EU. The head of the European Council has called him a threat to the EU. With the Mexican president, the Australian prime minister, he has problems with China. And the list goes on. So he is not a person, the Iranians believe, who is going to have an easy time building some sort of coalition against Iran. And at the same time, because of the deep divisions at home in the United States, many in Iran believe that it will be difficult for him to cause a great deal of trouble in the region. But it's still very too early to say, and we do not know him well.
It's not too early to say that he has increased sanctions on Iran after you tested a missile in January in breach of a United Nations resolution. That surely marks a deterioration in relations between you.
Well, the missile test was not in breach of the UN resolution. It was a conventional missile, and it was a test, and that has nothing to do with either the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the agreement between Iran and the P5+1 of the nuclear program, and it has nothing to do with the resolution that was passed alongside it.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you, because that's not what the American ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said. She said that Iran was believed to have tested a ballistic missile that is more than enough to be able to deliver a nuclear weapon, and she added that was something the world should be alarmed about.
Well, of course, that's what the Americans would say, but it is a conventional missile. The test is a routine test. All countries that have missile programs test their missiles every now and then. There was nothing exceptional, but the Americans were looking for an excuse. After all, the reason why Iran has developed a missile defense program is because of the constant threats that the United States has been making over the decades. All options are on the table is something that we've seen from Obama, from Bush, and from Clinton before him. So it's obvious that the Iranians would develop defense capabilities, and the reason why the United States has never attacked Iran is because it does have powerful capabilities. But I'd like to add that Obama too has violated the JCPOA before Trump, the new sanctions. After the signing of the agreement, the United States expanded the sanctions regime. He passed visa restriction laws, Mr. Obama. He signed the law.
Well, we're talking about Trump, if you don't mind.
And also he put pressure on banks.
Yeah. Okay, but if we could just stick...
Yes, but what I'm saying is that what Trump has done is not new.
All right. Okay, but the fact is, what is new is that there is concern that it does mark a step backwards. Mark Fitzpatrick, former US State Department official, extremely intimately involved with this whole issue and process behind the nuclear deal, which was signed in 2015 with the 6 world powers. He said in the middle of February, "I think that it is clear the nuclear deal is in jeopardy. Iran will be testing more missiles and so forth, and within a year, the deal will be under very severe pressure." Could that deal unravel?
Well, no, if it unravels, it has to do with the United States. I think the gentleman is trying to point his finger at the Iranians, where in fact it is the United States that is escalating the situation. According to the IAEA, Iran has abided by its side of the agreement. Iran has fully complied with its side of the bargain. Whereas the United States hasn't. In fact, according to the agreement, the United States is not supposed to prohibit banks and other financial institutions from working with Iran, yet the United States continues to do so even till today.
But the sanctions
and that is
relating,
in direct violation of the agreement.
But not all the sanctions were lifted as a result of the 2015 agreement, as you know, so they still pertain in some respects. So just looking at it a different way, President Trump has, of course, criticised the nuclear deal with Iran, but he has also said that in the Middle East, you need to focus on so-called Islamic State fighters in Syria. Now, that effectively puts the Americans on the same side as you, because you're fighting, you say, Islamic State fighters on the side of President Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So actually, you're in the same camp.
Well, that remains to be seen. The United States has a history of supporting countries that supported ISIS. We know from WikiLeaks that the United States knew from the Clinton emails that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were funding ISIS in 2014. We know from the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that the United States back then knew that the dominant force in Syria were the extremists and that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar were supporting them. And according to General Flynn, who did an interview back then, the United States took a willful decision to support these countries. So the United States has been supporting these extremists indirectly. It has also allowed Turkey to do extensive oil trade with over 10,000 tankers with ISIS.
Well, you know, the Turks,
in the past, the United States has been on the other side.
Because the Turks have completely and vehemently denied that that is the case. And of course the Saudis have also said they may have backed anti-Assad forces in the early days of the civil war, but in no way did they willfully go about trying to create what we now call Daesh or Islamic State.
Well, I'm basically referring to Defense Intelligence Agency documents, which is the most important Pentagon military intelligence organization, and I'm making reference to Hillary Clinton's emails. So this is not coming from Tehran. And the tankers are something that the Russians took photos of before they began bombing them. The Americans never bombed them until the Russians began to do that. But I'd also like to point out that an Iranian reporter, or at least an American Lebanese reporter working for Press TV, was murdered on the Turkish border when she reported that Turkey was using aid trucks linked to the UN to send in weapons and people into Syria. And then Turkey threatened her, and she was murdered the next day.
Of course, you're very opposed to the Turkish government because, of course, it is a Sunni one, and that is the whole point, really, of Iran, that wherever you have a Sunni power, be it Turkey, be it Saudi Arabia, whatever side they're on, you're going to take the other side. Let's just take one example of that, Yemen. We saw in 2014 the Shia Houthis, you backing them, and the Saudi-led coalition backing, of course, the forces of the internationally recognized government. We have this civil war now where the Iranians are arming the Houthi rebels with weapons, ammunition, and training them. So you are fueling conflict too.
Well, I think that's an extraordinary, dangerous accusation. The government in Afghanistan is a Sunni government. The majority of the country is Sunni. Afghanistan has good relations with Iran, but poor relations with Pakistan. In Iraq, when ISIS was about to take Arbil, which is a Kurdish Iraqi territory, Arbil, the Kurds there are predominantly Sunni. It was Iran that saved them from ISIS and no one else. In Syria, the minority Christians, Druze, Alawites, along with the Sufis and the Sunnis, were being attacked by ISIS. So I find that extraordinary that anyone could make such an accusation. These are Wahhabi groups, and they do not, I believe, represent Sunni Islam whatsoever.
You were
in the case of Yemen,
you were criticising the Turks, and I was just giving you the counterpoint. Mehmet Cavusoglu, for instance, the Turkish foreign minister, says in Iraq and Syria that Iran is trying to create a Shia crescent. So I'm just saying it's tit for tat. But I did ask you about Yemen, and now if you would...
No, that's not true. I will, but I was giving you documents that are American documents, photos that were shown by the Russian government.
Okay.
But in the case of Yemen, what happened was that Mansour Hadi was imposed upon the country. He was elected as the sole candidate in an election. He was supposed to be the transitional president for 2 years. After 2 years, he refused to step aside. Ultimately, the opposition groups went to the capital. The Iranians actually asked the Houthis not to take the capital. This is well documented. But they felt that they had to take the capital. He resigned. He fled the city. Ultimately, he fled the country. After 2 years of slaughter, where the Saudis bomb villages, towns, hospitals, funerals, schools,
this is
weddings,
collateral damage.
They still haven't been able to take the capital.
Okay, but I will ask you my question again, but just on that particular thing, yes, of course, there have been terrible civilian deaths, and they've been criticised, you know, internationally far and wide, but they don't target the civilians. They are targeting the Houthi rebels who sometimes are in civilian areas. But okay, but could you just answer this point, that whatever the background to this, and you mentioned President Mansour Abdul Hadi, who's the current president of an internationally recognised government by the United Nations and everybody else, whatever you may think about him. But the fact is, Iran is supporting the Houthi rebels. Why are you doing that? You are prolonging a terrible conflict in this country.
The Iranians are supporting the people that are being massacred and who have been under siege. And the United States and Western countries, including the British government, have been giving the Saudis weapons as well as cluster bombs to slaughter innocent civilians. And the Saudis' targeting has nothing to do with military targets. And the siege is preventing food from getting in. The Americans have created starvation alongside the Saudis. Almost 20 million people. In Ethiopia, once upon a time, when people were dying because of a drought, you made, in the world, there was all sorts of noise being made. Here, they are intentionally making people starve. Western governments, these are crimes against humanity, and there's no escape from that.
But the Iranians are also party to this conflict. So the main port in Yemen is Hodeidah, which is in the hands of the Houthi rebels, where we're not seeing enough aid going through. And you're absolutely right, 21 or 25 million people in Yemen, the total population 25 million, are in dire need of food aid, and there's now a famine alert is being sounded. But you are also involved in this conflict, so you must share some of this blame.
No, of course not. The country is surrounded. These people are being massacred, and they use Iran as an excuse in order to justify this massacre. History will show what Obama and Western governments have done in Yemen. These are crimes against humanity, and they will never be forgiven. The Iranians don't even have access to the country. It is surrounded by the Saudis. It is surrounded by the Americans. How can the Iranians provide aid for them?
Well, you know that weapons are supposed to be being smuggled. Let me tell you what Ambassador Khalid al-Yamani, the ambassador to the United Nations of Yemen, says. Houthi rebels have launched ballistic missiles in an indiscriminate and irresponsible manner, targeting the border with Saudi Arabia, resulting in hundreds of injuries and destruction of infrastructure, including schools and hospitals. And what he said was the kinds of missiles used were manufactured in Iran, and that is according to a United Nations Committee of Experts on Yemen, a UN committee of experts.
Really?
Yes. They're saying
really?
that the missiles used were manufactured in Iran.
United Nations? Are you talking about the same United Nations that put Saudi Arabia on a blacklist and removed it in 4 days?
Well, could you answer that question, though? When you say that you can't...
his shame?
When you say that Iran can't get equipment...
This person is not the representative of the Yemeni people. This person is someone who works for the Saudis. The reason why the Saudis have failed to take Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, is not because of some sect or group. It is because they failed against the will of the Yemeni people. And the Yemeni people are being sacrificed and murdered because Western countries are on the side of the Saudis because of their money, because of their clout, and because of their alliance with the Saudi regime. The Saudis are, by the way, just like in Syria.
Yeah, you won't answer. You won't answer.
I have that gentleman has.
No, it's not the gentleman. It's the UN Committee of Experts that are saying these missiles were manufactured in Iran that are being used in Yemen. And I've said that there are plenty of sources, Western diplomats who say that there are
the Houthis' missiles come from. But what I can say is that whatever weapons the Ansarullah and the Yemeni army is using against the Saudis is incomparable to the weapons that the Saudis have been using with the help of your government, with the help of the United States, and with the help of the French government. Right. And these are crimes against humanity. And forcing people into hunger is unjustifiable. Unjustifiable.
Well, nobody is...
It's criminal. It's murderous. And the mainstream media's silence is criminal.
No, but I'm saying, well, we're talking about it now, and we're highlighting it now, and I'm talking to you as an Iranian, and if we were talking to the Saudis, I'd put points to them. But the fact is, you are backing one side in a terrible civil war where the people are suffering in the manner that you've described. They don't have enough to eat.
The victims.
And I'm putting to you the fact that your country, you support the leadership, are party to this conflict and therefore complicit in the suffering. Okay, but you've talked a lot about Saudi Arabia, and it's very, very apparent. You've talked a lot about Saudi Arabia. It's very apparent that there is this animosity between Iran and Saudi Arabia, to the extent that now we see Washington...
No, it's actually between Iran and the United States.
Okay, well, the United States is now trying
It's actually between Iran and the United States.
The United States is now trying to entice...
The United States has supported...
Okay, but this point I was going to make to you is the United States is now trying to attract key Arab allies like Saudi Arabia, some Gulf states, also Egypt and Jordan, who have peace treaties with Israel, of course, into a kind of anti-Iran axis. Surely you must fear some kind of isolation now in your region.
No, of course not. These family oil-rich dictatorships have always been on the side of the United States, and they've always been an ally of the apartheid regime of Israel. The fact, though, on the ground is that contrary to what you're saying, the people in Yemen have been able to push back the Saudi onslaught because they do not accept Saudi hegemony. The people in Iran have been supporting the victims, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Libya. The destruction of Libya, I assume, is also Iran's fault. But the United States has supported extremists. They've helped create a civil war in Syria. Right. They've invaded Iraq. They've invaded Afghanistan. What the Americans are doing in this region is a repetition of what they did in the 1980s in Afghanistan, but at a much grander scale. We've got that message.
You refute the fact that Iran, with its interventions in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Yemen, or wherever, is not fueling conflict. You're not fueling conflict.
Zeinab, if it wasn't for Iran, there would be black flags in Damascus today. And if Syria had fallen, Iraq was on the verge of falling. Iran stopped Al-Qaeda or ISIL from taking Baghdad. Iran stopped them from taking Erbil. It was Iran that prevented this.
All right.
I think your reporters have gone to Syria. Contrary to the Western narrative, I think your reporters who've been to Syria know quite well that the people of Syria do not prefer the so-called moderates, which the U.S. Vice President, the former Vice President, said do not exist. They do not prefer those so-called moderates over the Syrian government.
Okay, but now, look, Iran spends about $1 billion a year supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria. You spend something like $800 million a year supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon and, you know, your various other interventions. Wouldn't that money be better used on developing Iran? You've got 13% unemployment. Most people say they're not satisfied with the economy. You should look to your own people and deliver their needs.
Zeinab, I don't know how much money Iran spends in Syria or Lebanon, but if Iran had not supported Syria and the people in Lebanon, we would not have a Syria today and we would not have a Lebanon.
But what about your own people?
And we probably would not have an Iraq.
What about your own people?
Well, then our people would have to be fighting ISIS inside Iran. If these countries had fallen, we would have to fight ISIS inside Iran. So it is not only our responsibility to resist the irresponsible behavior of Western countries by funding these extremists, by allowing these extremists to grow for the sake of the people in Syria and Iraq, but also for the sake of the Iranian people itself. If we hadn't prevented the spread of this disease, then we right now today would not have security in Iran either.
How will all this play against the background of the presidential elections due this May in Iran? And Hassan Rouhani, the incumbent, is expected to seek a second four-year term. But there is talk that perhaps there should be a more hardline candidate, or that Rouhani himself might somehow present himself with more hardline credentials. What's your view on that?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen in the election. I don't think it's going to have any major change with regards to Iran's regional policy or with regards to Iran's agreement with the P5+1. Whoever becomes the next president of Iran will abide by the agreement, and if the agreement fails, it's going to fail because of the Americans. Many people in Iran think it's not a good deal. Maybe many think it's a good deal. Many think it's something in between, but it's something that the Iranians agreed to. But what is interesting is that regardless of whether President Rouhani gets elected or not, which I think is going to depend more on the economy than anything else, but at least we have elections in Iran. At least we don't know who's going to be elected. Your good allies, the British and American allies in the region and Saudi Arabia, we know very well who's going to be in charge of the country in the coming months and years, and in other dictatorial regimes. We know who's going to be in charge, but that's not the case for Iran.
Well, you've had the same leader, the supreme leader.
Iran has a dynamic...
Well, you've had Ayatollah Khamenei is the supreme leader. Can't see him being elected. He's now in his mid-late 70s. That doesn't sound very democratic, does it? With the constraints on a democratically elected president.
Well, the leader, he is elected by a council which is itself elected.
But not
and
the
that
people.
Council can remove the leader whenever that council is elected by the people.
But it's
an
not,
indirect election.
Yes,
and he can be removed, but that's democratic.
Well, how long has he been in power?
Now, I think that liberal democracy in...
You've had two supreme leaders
liberal democracy
in your
right
history,
now in your
Ayatollah
country
Khomeini
and in the United States is not doing all that well.
Well, I was just making the point
I think that right now is not the time to start attacking Iran.
No, I was just saying, since the revolution in '79, you've only had two supreme leaders, Ayatollah Khomeini and now Khamenei, and on the surface, that doesn't look particularly democratic. Final brief word to you.
No, it looks fine, because the council that elects the leader can remove him. If they feel that he's doing a good job, he remains in power.
Okay, Mohammad Mirandi in Tehran, thank you very much indeed for coming on Hard Talk.
So he is not a person, the Iranians believe, who is going to have an easy time building some sort of coalition against Iran. And at the same time, because of the deep divisions at home in the United States, many in Iran believe that it will be difficult for him to cause a great deal of trouble in the region, but it's still very too early to say, and we do not know him well.
It's not too early to say that he has increased sanctions on Iran after you tested a missile in January in breach of a United Nations resolution. That surely marks a deterioration in relations.
With great interest. At the moment, the Iranians have not made many comments about what is going on in the United States. In many ways, they feel that Trump perhaps is not so bad for Iran in the sense that he is not doing a good job so far with regards to the international community. He has problems with the EU. The head of the European Council has called him a threat to the EU. With the Mexican president, the Australian prime minister, he has problems with China, and the list goes on.
Mohammad Mirandi in Tehran, welcome to Hard Talk. What does the Iranian leadership think of President Trump?
Well, thank you for having me. I think that they're still watching.
Welcome to Hard Talk with me, Zeinab Badawi. Amidst his pronouncements on foreign policy, Donald Trump has ratcheted up the rhetoric on Iran, calling the nuclear agreement with Tehran the worst deal ever negotiated. He's expanded US sanctions on Iran after it tested a missile in January. My guest is Iranian academic Mohammad Mirandi from Tehran, who supports the leadership in Iran. What is the Iranians' response to criticisms from Trump over its missile testing? And is Iran fueling terror and conflicts in the Middle East? It's between you.
Well, the missile test was not in breach of the UN resolution. It was a conventional missile, and it was a test, and that has nothing to do with either the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the agreement between Iran and the P5+1 of the nuclear program, and it has nothing to do with the resolution that was passed alongside it.
Sorry, can I just interrupt you, because that's not what the American ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said. She said that Iran was believed to have tested a ballistic missile that is more than enough to be able to deliver a nuclear